Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today our topic is slavery, abolition, and civil rights, subtitled A Quick Trip Through the History of African Americans. Before I even get started, I want to accent something that I've told you before, bears repeating. The AP people love questions on these topics. If there is something that I am virtually certain you will see at least a block of questions on, it's going to be the history of African Americans in the United States. So our objective today is a relatively simple one, to be able to describe the conflicts inherent in the paths of African Americans to full citizenship in the United States. And certainly there is no group of Americans who started further away from that goal than African Americans did. No one else, no other group of people in the country came here as property. And that, of course, brings us to part one of our discussion, plantation slavery. This economic system existed by and large everywhere from the Mason-Dixon line south and increasingly further and further west as time went by, of plantation slavery, of chattel slavery, in which people who were enslaved for life served largely as agricultural labor. And where does that begin? It begins in 1619 in Virginia, the colony of Virginia, right around Jamestown. Jamestown had had a very difficult time trying to provide for itself an economic basis. They had tried a number of things, none of them having worked very well. In 1619, a group of Africans were imported into Virginia as slaves. They were brought in by the Dutch. The Dutch, the people of Holland, great seafaring nation, brought the majority of the very early slaves into America. Now, interestingly enough, these very early slaves, and this really went away very, very quickly, but it is significant to point out that many of these very early slaves really were treated very much like as the English treated indentured servants. And so they were brought into America, they were purchased, they were bound to the person who purchased them for a term of years, usually about 7, and then given their freedom. However, that went away very fast. Certainly by 1650, that situation has changed because of the immense shortage of labor in the American South. And for the most part, unless you were coming into the American South with money to purchase land, you generally tended to avoid the South. You came into the North, you came into the middle colonies, because those were places that had a greater degree of economic opportunity for those who didn't start out with money in the bank. And because of that shortage of labor, we have a situation in which slavery comes to be a lifetime process. They entered into what was often called the Barbados system, because we're following a pattern that started after the 1640s in Barbados, other sugar colonies, where the shortage of labor that the American South faced was minuscule in comparison with that which was faced in Barbados, because sugar was such an inherently difficult and really disease-ridden process. You were much further south. The treatment of the workers was much worse. The work was much more difficult. And so in Barbados, we see the beginnings of this chattel slavery that began there. And again, this is chattel slavery. You are the enslaved person was a possession for life. Their children were born into slavery and would also be enslaved for life. and on and on and on, as far away as anybody could see. And obviously that system did indeed endure for a little bit more than 200 years here in America. Now, interestingly enough, slavery very nearly died out. And one of the questions that is often asked when you look at our founding documents, at our Declaration of Independence, at our Constitution, is the idea that why, if these people believed so much in liberty, and they did, why, if these people believed so much in liberty, did they not end slavery? Well, the simple answer is they believed that slavery was dying. Why did they believe slavery was dying? A very simple reason. It was becoming less profitable. Most of the enslaved people who came into the southern part of North America during the 1600s, 1700s were engaged in one of two trades, either tobacco planting, primarily in Virginia, or the cultivation of rice, primarily in South Carolina. The cultivation of rice was largely used to feed enslaved people in Barbados so that the land there could be used for the cultivation of sugar, and without wasting land, or wasting land as you might put it in quotes, that could be used to for the successful and very, very, very profitable cultivation of sugar. However, the tobacco planting regions, tobacco had started out, it was immensely popular at first. The English had an appetite for tobacco that had already been established some years earlier when Turkish tobacco began to be imported into Great Britain in the very early 1600s. So this appetite for tobacco was there. The Virginia tobacco was thought to be not quite as good, but it was immensely less expensive. And so what you had was a sort of situation where the upper class was using tobacco from Turkey, the middle class were using tobacco from Virginia, which looked like, at any rate, the tobacco from Turkey. You had to actually be consuming it to know the difference. And at first that started out to be, it was immensely profitable, popular in Great Britain. That made it immensely profitable for those people who first planted it in the 1640s, 1650s. But slavery was gradually becoming less popular. And much of the profit in slave trading was disappearing. And so it appeared to be gradually dying out. And frankly, by the 1770s, 1780s, that disease was quite well along. Plantation slavery was basically sustaining itself because of the money that had already been invested in it, and because the slave owners would sustain massive losses, which they did not wish to sustain. During that period of time, they did not wish to get rid of their slaves, and so we have this gradual change in the process of plantation slavery. So we speculate, and that's really all it is. There's not like there are documents saying, slavery is dying out, therefore we don't need to deal with it. But it appears that those founding fathers who thought much about slavery, and it is uncertain how many of those there were. We know about the more important ones. We know that George Washington was thinking about slavery. We know that Thomas Jefferson was thinking about slavery. We know that John Adams was thinking about slavery. Benjamin Franklin had founded an anti-slavery society. But really most of America is not thinking very much about slavery one way or the other, whether they own slaves or not. This is not a big ethical dilemma that many people are kind of facing up to. But, so we have to kind of, as I said, we're speculating that these founding fathers, these men who thought that slavery was passing away, that they were simply thinking it was dying out, and that's why that they made no attempt to do away with the institution. And this is accentuated by the fact that we can see that almost immediately after the Revolution, all of the states north of the Mason-Dixon line initiated some sort of process to abolish slavery. Now, in most cases, it was a very, very gradual process. And I'm going to grab some numbers out of thin air, but basically, a state might pass a law in, let us say, 1781, saying that as of 1790, slaves would no longer be purchased and sold in that state. That children born after January the 1st, 1790 would become free when they reached the age of 21. Those who were already in slavery would continue to serve as slaves until their natural death. Something like that. So that, under the standards of that time, that meant that slavery would within 30 years would be a thing of the past. As those slaves died, as the younger slaves reached this age of independence, if you will. And that was true in all the states north of the Mason-Dixon line. So basically everything north of Maryland passed laws very, very quickly. Virginia even considered it, but rejected it by a relatively narrow margin. So you can see that there is this erosion, if you will, that's probably the best term for it, in the popularity of the slave system. However, that ended in 1793 with the invention of this thing called the cotton gin. Cotton had been grown in the American South. Most of it again in South Carolina, where you could grow a particular variety of cotton called long staple cotton. Relatively few seeds, relatively long fibers, but the problem with long staple cotton was that it was very selective in terms of the areas where it grew. Like tobacco, it wouldn't grow everywhere. There was a variety of cotton that would grow anywhere that it was warm enough, but it was called short staple cotton. Short staple cotton was the fibers were not as long, they were somewhat stickier, and they called them bolls, B-O-L-L, these cotton balls, these balls of a little cotton with seeds inside and kind of leaves growing around them, and there were a lot more seeds in the short staple cotton, and so the process of pulling those seeds out was really quite laborious. And so while you could grow the stuff, and while perhaps you might get some use out of it in terms of the family making their own clothing out of it, the immense amount of time that it took to pull the seeds out made it unprofitable, even if you were using slave labor for long-term use, or for as an agricultural product being grown for profit. But once Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin, which is a really very simple machine, and if you want to go into your books, you'll find, or head over to the internet, you can pull it up. It's really basically just it's a kind of device where you have two combs that are around a central shaft that are growing together. That kind of intertwine with each other, and you feed the cotton in, and these tines would pull out the seeds, and they would go in one direction, and the cotton fiber itself would go in another direction. And that made slavery once again very profitable. And it wasn't just profitable in Virginia and South Carolina. It is now profitable throughout the South. Anywhere that is warm enough to grow this short staple cotton is a place where now slavery can be participated in profitably. And that gives it a new lease on life. And in fact, we see that the business of slavery grows dramatically. However, one of the few things that the Founding Fathers said about slavery when they wrote the Constitution was that slavery would be, not slavery itself, excuse me, the importation of slaves would become illegal 20 years after the ratification of the Constitution. That point was reached in 1808, which meant that you could no longer bring new slaves legally in from Africa. Now, certainly there was some smuggling that went on, but it's relatively difficult to smuggle a human being, as opposed to a product that is, that you can put in a box and carry in. That doesn't really work with human beings. And so the smuggling of slaves, while it always existed, was always difficult and frankly never very prevalent. So what began to happen then was that owners of slaves who were already here, even if they were living on land that was marginal, began to see a substantial side business, if you will, in the breeding of slaves, in mating the slaves to produce children. And once that child reached the age of, say, 10, that child began to have a real value. And so that continued on, and actually you have a situation where you have a decreasing supply and an increasing demand. So the price of slaves actually went up considerably after 1808, and got as high as roughly $800 for an unskilled field hand slave, male, at about age, say 17, something like that. He'd reached full physical maturity, so he could certainly do a day's work, and had several years left in him, presumably with reasonably good care, before he would become infirm and of course eventually pass away. So the more profitable plantation slavery became, the more Southerners clung to it. And increasingly, after the invention of the cotton gin, and then after 1808, and increasingly as we get into the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, we see a number of attempts to do away with plantation slavery. However, there's great resistance to that, and the Southerners who are profiting from this system and who would have lost immense wealth had slavery suddenly become illegal, clung very, very hard to this institution. But let's take some time to look at the people who were trying to do away with it. And there's several organizations that are trying to do away with chattel slavery as the 1800s unrolls. The first one is something called the American Colonization Society. As you can see, it was started in 1817, and its initial leaders are some fairly familiar names. I would certainly hope you would recognize the name of the fourth President of the United States, James Madison, who was President of the United States at the time that the Colonization Society began. You may recognize the name of Henry Clay, who would eventually become the leading light of the Whig political party, during the age of Jackson. At this point, he is in Congress, and he's a substantial slave owner in the western part of the relatively new state of Kentucky. So these are, for the most part, these are slave-owning people. So they're not particularly interested in abolishing slavery immediately. What do they want to see? They want to see voluntary emancipation. In other words, appeal somehow to slave owners to let their slaves go. Usually, in the mind of the American Colonization Society, that meant through purchase. In other words, the society would raise money to purchase enslaved people and then transport them to Africa. And in fact, they established a colony, eventually became an independent nation in the western part of Africa called Liberia. So how are they going to do this? Well, they were going to do it by lobbying Congress. And again, many of these people are very well placed. So this is a thoroughly reasonable possibility that they could perhaps persuade Congress to earmark a certain amount of revenue for the purpose of purchasing these enslaved people and transporting them to Africa. That never happened, but it was a reasonable idea. And of course, they're raising money through voluntary contributions. So what begins to happen? Well, the outcome of it is relatively small, considering the couple million slaves that were in the country at the time. They were successful in raising enough money to purchase 15,000 enslaved people and transporting them to, again, what became the nation of Liberia. And interestingly enough, their one success in Congress was that Congress passed a law ordering the cargoes of ships that were captured while attempting to smuggle slaves into America, or into the United States, and that those enslaved people would also be sent to Liberia. So it's a small effort. It's not incredibly successful, but it is a beginning. Much more important in American history, although really not terribly successful either in its first years, is this thing called the American Anti-Slavery Society, founded in 1833 by a very, very virulent abolitionist by the name of William Lloyd Garrison. Now, if the Colonization Society was gentle and wanted gradual abolition, Garrison is a real bomb thrower. He wants immediate abolition without compensation to slave owners. He sees slavery as fundamentally evil, and he does not want to see any amount of taxpayer money being used to compensate people for, so that they will stop doing something that is evil. So obviously he is a much, much more controversial character, and indeed there were southern states that put a bounty on his head, that if somebody had kidnapped Garrison and transported him to a southern state where he could be put in jail, there was a reward for him, which is really rather interesting. At any rate, what are they going to do? Well, Garrison went around the country, and Garrison and others, and I'm sure you're familiar with the name of Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was an associate of William Lloyd Garrison's, and they would go around and do these public lectures, and the public lectures were really quite popular. Certainly in the Northeast, those areas that had already agreed to do away with slavery. In fact, Douglass himself was a pretty considerable draw because he was that seemingly unique character, a dark-skinned African who was extremely intelligent. And for many people, and I realize this is going to sound extremely patronizing, but this is the way it was seen, that Garrison, that Douglass would come and he surprised people. At first, he was obviously African. He was a very dark-skinned man. He was dressed well. He spoke extremely well. He was highly literate. And he was able to convince many Northerners that there was fundamentally no difference between themselves and African Americans other than the color of skin, and that the color of skin was not in and of itself sufficient to condemn someone to a life of chattel slavery. Garrison's most long-lasting product was a newspaper. It was called The Liberator. It circulated across a very narrow band of people. It was around for about 20 years or so. But in a sense, Garrison really is condemned as far too radical. Even Northerners who are, can certainly wrap their brains around some sort of compensated / gradual abolition, and obviously there's states have done it already, but they just see this guy Garrison as somebody who's just out there, and clearly Southerners think he's just the devil incarnate, and so the actual effectiveness of the American Anti-Slavery Society is pretty marginal. They made a lot of noise, didn't really get much accomplished. Another organization is the American and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society, started in 1840. Its leadership is abolitionist, but not as radical as Garrison. Their leaders are men named Theodore Weld, Lewis Tappan, and Arthur Tappan, the Tappan brothers, and they are interested in getting slavery done away with, but they're willing to do it gradually. And if some scheme can be worked out to compensate the slave owners, so much the better. That if you can get rid of slavery peacefully, without rancor and animosity, then that's clearly the way to do it. Now, you'll notice again, it's starting in 1840. And by 1840, attitudes towards slavery in the South are beginning to really rigidify. That process began with the tariff and nullification crisis of 1832 to 1833. And so really starting at that point, Southerners kind of get very, very sensitive about the subject of slavery. And there begins to be this class of people called fire eaters that are just, they're very sensitive to any attempt to end slavery. And so even though these men tried to be much more conciliatory than the bomb thrower that Garrison was, nonetheless, they got a pretty considerable reaction. Again, the means of their, spreading the word. Again, lectures were, really very popular entertainment. And I realize that may seem very strange to you. You think of lecture as something through which you need to work and suffer. But in the days before television and radio and movies and other means of popular entertainment, to go to a lecture where somebody was going to talk intelligently and entertainingly about a topic that was of common interest was considered to be a pretty good evening's entertainment. They certainly write a lot of newspaper articles. There were attempts by them to put newspapers of their own together. Weld certainly had a situation where his presses were destroyed by this sort of roving band of pro-slavery people. So they encountered a great deal of resistance. They worked very closely with something called the Liberty Party, because at about the same time, this Liberty Party organization grows up, and it's a political party that was organized specifically to try to end slavery. The outcome is really, fairly marginal. They don't really accomplish much as a society. They disbanded in 1855, so basically they were only around for about 15 years. But many of their members became influential as part of this new thing called the Republican Party, and that they would play a role in Republican politics, eventually helping to get Lincoln elected, many of them being some of the more radicals in terms of trying to push Lincoln in the direction of emancipation. And that's just a totally different story, totally outside of our scope today. So we're going to jump straight through the Civil War, not because that information is not important, but because I could easily spend 2 or 3 hours on the Civil War and the process of freeing the enslaved people during that time. We did do a whole lesson on that much earlier in the year. You should still have the notes from that lesson in your notebook, and if you feel the need to look at those notes and review that material, let me strongly suggest that you do so. So let's jump ahead to the past
the whole Civil War and Reconstruction period, and look at what happens after Reconstruction. And there's a reality to Reconstruction, and we talked about it at the time, that Reconstruction, or the way you felt about Reconstruction, largely depended on how Reconstruction had affected you. For some people, it was a time of freedom, of flowering, of opportunity, and certainly the freedmen, which was the term we used at the time to describe the former slaves, that was the way they looked at Reconstruction. There's this brief period of time, about 12 years, when they're able to exercise many of the rights of citizenship, and we see wide amounts of African Americans voting. We are seeing schools being established. We're seeing African Americans buying land, serving on juries, running for and being elected to public office. And so there's this kind of island of time, if you will, for about 15 years, or 12 years, 1865 to 1877, in which it really appeared that some sort of at least political equality was within reach. Obviously, that was not the view of everybody, and again, we talked about this fairly extensively when we talked about Reconstruction, and again, I'm going to suggest that you look at your notes if you're not familiar with that discussion. That ends, however, with the Compromise of 1877, and troops are pulled out of the South, control is passed to Southern whites, and we see the beginnings of what is called the Jim Crow era of American politics, and particularly again in the South. We're going to look at 5 African Americans who emerged as leaders during this period. But before I look at individuals, we see almost instantly, certainly by the turn of the 20th century, there's a real split. And that split is going to continue for many years down through the civil rights period, where there is, in a sense, one movement of African Americans that is primarily rural, primarily Southern, and then at least initially, much, much smaller movement that is more urban and more Northern. And they're going to disagree with each other about what should happen with the enslaved people, or with the formerly enslaved people, and what is the best process to gain political equality. And the first of those leaders is a man named Booker T. Washington. Now, of all of the African Americans that we're going to discuss, of these 5 during the period after Reconstruction, Booker T. Washington is the only one to have ever been a slave. As you can see from the dates, he was born in 1856, which means that slavery ended when he was 9. And then he grows up, so he's coming to maturity in this Reconstruction period, but he hadn't quite reached that point. He's 21 years old when Reconstruction ends. But a man of clear intelligence, of clear ability, and he's trying to, in a sense, he's kind of fighting, if you will, kind of rearguard action. He sees the slow creep, at least at first it was slow, creep of these Jim Crow laws of segregation, and he is trying to do what he can to prevent this contagion from getting larger. And his message is very simple and very conciliatory. He's trying to convince Americans, particularly white Southerners, that they don't need to fear the African American. And he's telling the African American, learn useful skills, strive for economic success. And in the world of the middle of the 1800s, especially in the South, the most useful skills were agricultural. There were others. There were certainly mechanical skills. Certainly blacksmithing was often a process by which African Americans could achieve at least some sort of local respect in their communities. And that's where Booker T. Washington is focusing. learn these useful skills, attain for yourself some economic success, and political equality would follow. That as you proved yourself to be an important member of the community, as you proved yourself to be an asset to the community, then you would gain the respect of the people around you, who would gradually lose their opposition to the idea that you should be able to exercise your rights as a citizen. Washington has an interesting group of supporters, and a very, very diverse group of supporters. First off, lots of rural blacks. He's preaching a message that is of use to them. He's not telling them to do something radical. He's not trying to tell them to do things that are going to get them killed. That he's telling them to make themselves useful, and that will achieve for them a certain economic success. Interestingly enough, Washington has other supporters as well, notably some very wealthy white industrialists, mostly from the North. They too look at Booker T. Washington and his proposed solution to the race problem, as it was seen at the time, and they're looking at this and saying, this is a logical process. Washington is intelligent. He's not asking for the moon, and it's something that they could get their minds around, and to which they were willing to contribute money. And we see that there are a number, not only just supporting Booker T. Washington, but a lot of the very early African American universities get started with money that comes from wealthy whites in the North. And some of the more liberal Southern whites. Again, Booker T. Washington's message is not threatening in any way. Those who are, for those who were trying to put the freedmen into a box that was as close to slavery as was legally possible, they weren't going to support Washington, but there were many Southern whites of goodwill who were willing to give this message a chance. So how does Washington try to do this? Well, he's going to accommodate white society. He founded a school of his own called the Tuskegee Institute. The Tuskegee Institute was a very important school for African Americans. It still exists. And you may be familiar with a group of World War II pilots called the Tuskegee Airmen, who were recruited from Tuskegee Institute and trained to fly, and became an important part of the U.S. Air Force during the Second World War. His significance, well, he raised a lot of money, not just for his school, but for lots of African American schools, and not just for colleges, but for elementary schools and high schools. And he's able to work behind the scenes to soften the effects of segregation. After the turn of the 20th century, he sort of establishes something of a relationship with Theodore Roosevelt. And it would become, interestingly, the first African American to go to the White House socially as somebody other than a servant when Theodore Roosevelt invites him to have lunch. And ended up being very controversial, and Roosevelt did not repeat it. But nonetheless, he's got a relationship with these with wealthy and influential white Northerners, and certainly Theodore Roosevelt is of that class. So he's able to work behind the scenes to at least soften the edges of segregation, and to make it at least somewhat more tolerable. Now, there are those, however, who see Washington as far too willing to accommodate. And the most vocal of those is W.E.B. Du Bois. William Edward Burghardt Du Bois. He's born in 1868, so as you can see, he's born after the era of slavery. So he's really a child during Reconstruction. He died in 1965, so he's around for a very, very long time. And he's northern, and he's more urban. And his message is very different. He sees the process, almost the inverse process that Booker T. Washington saw. Booker T. Washington said that you should make yourself economically useful. That will establish economic success, and the political equality would follow. W.E.B. Du Bois's message is that you need to get political equality first. That no matter what you have gained until you have political equality, it can be taken from you. And his audience was the people that he called the talented tenth. Basically, his assumption was that roughly 1/10 of the African American population of the United States had at least some education. And so he wants to build up that talented tenth and then entrust that talented tenth with the task of leading all blacks to equality. And he means full, immediate political equality. That's a much more threatening message to the white South. But again, W.E. Du Bois is Northern and he is urban. So who's supporting W.E.B. Du Bois? Intellectuals, a lot of college people. W.B. Du Bois himself gained a doctorate degree. He wrote quite a lot. He wrote well, and he had an audience among the liberal intellectuals in again primarily northern colleges. He also has a great deal of support among black professionals. Again, more support in the North than in the South, but there are some black professionals in the North. Now, what they called professionals and what you may think of as professionals is maybe somewhat different. These are people who are fairly low on the professional scale. There were, however, African American lawyers. Now they're not going to be hired by white clients for the most part, but they are going to be around to meet the legal needs of other African Americans. There were African American doctors who, again, had a client base that was largely African American. School teachers were considered to be very important professionals. Interestingly enough, morticians. There was a big emphasis on your burial within the community of the freedmen. That it was, no matter how bad your life had been, that the manner of your burial was extremely important. And so lots of African Americans would scrimp and save and put a quarter a week away so that they could have a life insurance policy that would yield enough money to bury them decently, to purchase a casket and to get them, properly attended to and so on. And so oftentimes those professionals in the mortuary trade in southern communities were tremendously important. Again, urban northern blacks, and white progressives. Again, but it's hard to say more progressive than Theodore Roosevelt, but, the people who were, kind of at the extremes, and not all progressives by any means. If you remember, Woodrow Wilson, who was a progressive, was extremely anti-black. So, lots of progressives were not in favor of them, but some were. And so he enjoys a bit of support from that direction as well. What are his methods? He wrote a lot. And he formed an organization, still exists, called the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. They are very prominent in a number of ways. They put out national publications. But they also form, interestingly enough, a group of lawyers that form something called the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and we'll talk about them just a little bit more in a moment. What is their significance? Well, there is they first, as I pointed out earlier, they challenged Booker T. Washington They again, and this sort of historical debate, if you will, between Du Bois and Washington is a very popular one among American history teachers. I'm not sure that the two men ever met. I don't think they ever debated each other face to face, but nonetheless, their ideas coming at roughly the same time and being substantially different, is sort of a very popular historical argument. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if you ended up writing an essay or doing a short answer question or something where that asked you to contrast these, the ideas of these two men. Not going to guarantee that, but as I said, the AP people like questions about this sort of thing, and this is a popular one amongst historians. A moment or two ago, I mentioned the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. This is a group of lawyers. They're going to be extremely important because they're taking a different tack. They're going into courts to fight against discrimination. And indeed, at first, their progress is very, very slow, but these are the people that would bring a case that called Brown versus Board of Education to the Supreme Court. The lawyer and eventual Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall was the head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund during the 1940s and 1950s, and he brought a number of cases to court to fight against discrimination. Now, our third leader is a very different character altogether. His name was Marcus Garvey. He was born in the Bahamas in 1887, and he has a very different message altogether. His message is black self-sufficiency. His idea is that African Americans are never going to get a fair shake in the United States, that they need to separate themselves from society, that they can't ever hope to be integrated, that white America will never treat them well no matter what their achievements are, and therefore they should seek to separate themselves to the extent that they can from the rest of white society. At the same time, instilling a pride in African heritage, and he creates something called the Back to Africa movement, where he's trying to create an organization to take Africans, it's almost an echo of the Anti-Colonization Society, but basically this being done by African Americans for themselves, to pool their resources and actually leave America and move to Africa. Now, relatively few people do that, but it's an interesting idea at the time, and it did have its supporters. So who are his supporters? Well, first, urban blacks, not in big numbers, but enough. He's enough that he became at least somewhat famous, particularly during the early 1920s, which is kind of his period of greatest prominence. He created a wide number of organizations, the most important one being the Universal Negro Improvement Association. He created a number of businesses. He encouraged other African Americans to support other black-owned businesses, basically the idea being that if you should not do business with somebody who doesn't want to treat you well, and so you should be funneling your money into your own community. He did try, he was not terribly successful, he did try to establish some economic ties within Africa. If you may remember from world history that at this point in history, most of Africa is ruled by some European nation or another, and there's not a whole lot of sympathy for what he wants to do within the governing powers in Africa. He did manage to establish some contact with Liberia, some contact with the other independent country in Africa, Ethiopia, but it really didn't go a whole long way. But there was the attempt. What is his significance? Well, he's really kind of interesting in that he is the first leader to appeal to the idea that blacks should be proud of being black. In a sense, W.E.B. Du Bois is saying, you need to become useful, and in your usefulness you can take pride. And Du Bois is saying that you need to develop a political consciousness and develop yourself educationally, and you can take pride in that. Marcus Garvey is saying just be proud because you're black, and that's a very different message, because obviously you could be proud of being black even if you had not developed skills, or even if the breaks had not fallen your way. He does reach a lot of urban northern blacks, not really the intellectuals. They tended to support Du Bois, but there was a substantial number of northern blacks who were not quite at that level, who found Garvey's ideas very interesting. Eventually, however, he would come to a kind of unfortunate end. In the process of creating the Universal Negro Improvement Association, creating these businesses, he sold stock in some of those businesses. Those businesses did not have any assets. They largely existed as a kind of a promise for the future, and that's illegal. You can't sell stock in a company that really doesn't exist, or that exists only on paper. And so he was imprisoned for securities fraud and eventually deported back to the Bahamas in the late 1920s. And he died in the Bahamas. I believe he stayed in the Bahamas the rest of his life, dying in 1940. Now, a name that, if I'd asked you to give me a name at the beginning of class, somebody that we would definitely touch on, you probably would have said Martin Luther King. Far and away the most famous African-American leader of his or any other generation. And King's message, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on this because it's probably something that you're pretty familiar with already, is that justice is going to be obtained through moral and peaceful means. And so we're going, non-violence. And again, if you don't know what those means are, look it up. Because it's not hard to find. And so there's kind of and really his goal is to use this nonviolence resistance to alert whites to the injustice that's going on. Obviously, African Americans knew they were being badly treated, but it was very possible, especially in the days before television, to be a white person of goodwill and just not know that there was a problem, or to be a white Southerner who wasn't intimately connected with this as an issue and just think that, well, this is the way things are, and we're pretty happy with this system, and it looks like the African Americans who that we find either working as domestic servants or doing menial tasks, they appear to be happy with the situation. And so to just not know that there was a problem. Later, he's going to do some targeting of economic inequality, but that's going to happen relatively late in his life, and really very close to the end. When he is, in fact, when he's assassinated in 1968, he was, he really, having achieved the Civil Rights Act of 1965 and the Voting Rights, Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Once those are passed, then he turns to more economic topics. Who are his supporters? Well, Martin Luther King is a Southerner. He is more rural. Now, he's coming out of Atlanta, which is the biggest city in the South, but remember that during his youth, the biggest city in the South still wasn't very big. And so he's not necessarily a rural character himself, but he's certainly not an urban character as we would understand being urban in the modern world. So his supporters are rural Southern blacks. He was a Baptist minister, And his much of his appeal was religious in nature, and so he had a special affinity with other rural Southern blacks who, for whom religion was an important commodity. He also enjoys the support of white Northern liberals. He's again, I'm sure you've heard him, recordings of him speaking. He was very urbane, very intelligent, very well spoken, and he did on a number of occasions tour the North and impressed quite a lot of people. His methods are nonviolent protest. And again, if you want to know the specifics of that, I'm going to ask you to take a look at that in your book, because we're running a little bit long already. He is very interested in marches and demonstrations. He wrote a lot. He spoke a lot. So we see, again, it's really this very typical way that African American leaders had communicated in the past. So he's really, he's an African American leader, which means he wants changes, but he's really more traditional, and you can kind of see more of kind of the Booker T. Washington strain coming through Martin Luther King. Now, don't go too far with that analogy, but in a sense, I think if your father or grandfather was the kind of person who supported Booker T. Washington, you were likely going to be a supporter of Martin Luther King. What's significant about him? Well, my goodness, he is a truly significant person, and clearly he was successful in opening the eyes of people to the immorality of the Jim Crow system. His unfortunate assassination in 1968 caused many urban African Americans to see his path as too slow and too uncertain, and a series of riots broke out in over 100 cities around the country immediately or shortly after his assassination. Now, as W.E.B. Du Bois is to Booker T. Washington, Malcolm X is to Martin Luther King. Malcolm X is urban. He's much more sophisticated. He's Northern. Malcolm X came out of Detroit, which was, obviously there was discrimination going on in Detroit very, very clearly, but it was of a different nature than the discrimination that was faced by Southerners. And so Malcolm X grew up, in a sort of, in a sort of city situation. He had some very early contacts of he spent a lot of his time in nightclubs and around people who were living a very different life than the religious life of Martin Luther King. So his message, as he develops it, is very, very different. Black power, black nationalism. So in a sense, he's borrowing some of this from W.E.B. Du Bois. He's borrowing other elements that were part of the message of Marcus Garvey, that basically he argues very, very strongly that whites are the enemy, that African Americans were never going to get a fair shake from whites, and that they needed to separate themselves to the extent that was possible. Now, he's not suggesting that people go back to Africa, but he is suggesting that African Americans needed to set up their own social system exclusively unto themselves. Interestingly enough, Malcolm X was a member for much of his life of the Black Muslim movement, and if you want some more information about that, and it probably would not be a bad idea, you might want to look up that movement or its leader, who was a man named Elijah Muhammad, who's the founder of the Black Muslim movement. And for a number of years, he and Malcolm X worked very closely together. They separated toward the end of Malcolm X's life, but for much of Malcolm X's active life, he's affiliated with Elijah Muhammad as a spokesperson for this for the Black Muslim movement. Who are his supporters? Well, basically, his biggest supporters are other members of the Black Muslims. This Nation of Islam, as the official name of the movement. And then, again, northern, urban, black youths found him especially inspiring, and some white student radicals, people who were very, very liberal, and they were persuaded to support Malcolm X as well. His methods are much more violent. That basically, he's not arguing that African Americans should start violence, but if they are, if they are acted upon violently, it is perfectly permissible for them to respond in kind. He is very militant. He spoke a lot. He wrote some. In fact, his book, the most famous book, is something called The Autobiography of Malcolm X. It was actually published after his death, but it's very readable. And if you ever have the opportunity to pick it up, it's really pretty instructive, because if your vision of the typical African American, if there is such a thing, is sort of that Southern sharecropper and so on. Well, his life is very, very different from that, and he goes into that in a fair amount of detail in the book. And he urges self-defense. Now he's frightening. I mean, whites who are, who think that Martin Luther King is wonderful and are quite willing to get behind King, they really don't like Malcolm X. He's frightening. He opposes gradualism. He wants it all at once. He himself was assassinated, actually 3 years before King was assassinated in 1965. Now, the reaction to his death was not nearly as great as it was with King, but nonetheless, there is a significance there. Okay, so that's where we end our process today. We've been at this for about an hour, so I would assume by now that you've got a fair amount of your notes are there, and we'll talk to you again.